Bayo sat at the small wooden table, staring at the half-filled pot of watery porridge. She stirred it slowly, trying to make it look enough for her daughter, little Nari, who sat quietly, holding her empty bowl. The room was dim, the light from the small lamp flickering weakly on the cracked walls. Bayo's heart ached watching her child's tired face, wishing she could do more. She worked hard every day, yet they never seemed to have enough to eat. Just then, there was a soft knock on the door. Her father, Mr. Toma, stood outside, holding a small bag of fruits. He smiled gently, but his eyes quickly scanned the room. He saw the empty plates, the nearly empty pot, and his granddaughter's thin face. His smile faded as he sat down slowly, his voice low but filled with concern. Bayo, you earn $3,000 every month. Why is your child hungry? Bayo froze. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. She wanted to tell him everything. How her husband always took her salary. How she was left with nothing. But before she could speak, the door opened again. Fani walked in, cheerful and confident, as if everything in the world was fine. Because I gave her salary to my family, he said proudly. They needed it more than we do. Bayo's eyes widened. She turned to him in disbelief. Mr. Toma's expression hardened as he looked from his daughter to her husband. The air in the room grew heavy. Nari clutched her mother's hand, sensing the tension but not understanding the words. Fani laughed a little, as if expecting praise for what he'd done. It's good to help family, isn't it? He said. But no one replied. Mr. Toma's jaw tightened. His daughter looked down, tears gathering in her eyes. The spoon slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft clang. In that moment, Bayo felt the weight of everything she had been holding inside. The exhaustion, the shame, the hunger, the endless giving. Her father's question echoed in her head, and Fani's words cut deeper than ever. She realized how far things had gone, how much she had lost trying to keep peace. The room was silent, but inside her heart, something began to break, and something else, deep within, began to awaken. Fani grew up in a big family that believed every good thing should be shared among them. When Bayo married him, she didn't know that her salary would soon become everyone's money. The moment her paycheck came in, Fani would take most of it and send it to his parents and brothers. He called it his duty. To him it was love, respect, and tradition. To Bayo, it slowly became a heavy chain she couldn't escape. Every month, when she tried to talk to him about saving something for their own home or for Nari's school fees, he would look at her with irritation. Do you want people to say my wife is selfish? He would say sharply. Those words always silenced her. She didn't want anyone to think she was heartless. She wanted peace in her marriage. She wanted to believe that helping his family would bring blessings. But all it brought was emptiness in their home. Fani's family lived well. They threw big gatherings, wore new clothes, and spoke proudly of how their son had a generous wife. They never asked how Bayo was doing. They didn't know she sometimes skipped breakfast so that Nari could have lunch at school. They didn't know she walked long distances to save on bus fare. They didn't see her come home late at night, exhausted, still trying to cook something for her family with whatever little remained. When bills piled up, Fani would tell her not to worry, that his family would help if things got worse. But they never did. The more Bayo worked, the more he gave away. Her efforts filled their lives with comfort while she and her daughter lived with less and less. At first, Bayo told herself this was love, that this was what good wives did. She thought her patience and sacrifice would one day make Fani see how much she cared. But instead he grew prouder, always talking about how much he supported his family, never once realizing the cost his wife was paying for his pride. Every time she handed him her paycheck, she felt something small inside her fade, a piece of hope, a bit of strength, a little of her joy. The woman who once smiled easily now forced herself to believe everything would change someday. But deep down, she was beginning to see the truth, that Fani's idea of love was just duty wrapped in control, and her silence was slowly becoming her prison. Mr. Toma sat quietly at the corner of the small table that night, his hands folded, his eyes heavy with thoughts. He watched his daughter, Bayo, move around the room, trying to serve the thin porridge as if it were a full meal. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the bowl in front of her father, then another for her daughter. There wasn't enough for everyone, but she smiled weakly, pretending everything was fine. Fani sat across the table, speaking proudly about his family. He talked about how he had sent money to his parents again, how his brothers were planning another gathering, and how it was his duty, as the eldest son, to keep everyone happy. To him it was a sign of pride, a badge of honor. He didn't notice the way Bayo's shoulders dropped with every word, or how her father's expression grew tighter. For a long while, Mr. Toma said nothing. He simply listened, watching this young man boast about generosity while his granddaughter sat quietly, too weak to eat. Inside, his anger grew, but he held it back, choosing his words carefully. The air felt heavy, filled with unspoken truth. Finally, he put his spoon down and looked at Fani directly. His voice was calm, but there was something sharp in it that made even Fani's smirk fade slightly. "You don't feed your own child," he said slowly, "but you feed the ones who mock her hunger. What kind of man celebrates that?" The room went silent. Bayo froze, her eyes filling with tears. Fani looked at her father-in-law, offended but still trying to act proud. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You wouldn't understand. You raised your daughter to chase money, not family." Bayo lowered her gaze, her heart aching. She wanted to defend herself, to speak up, but her voice was trapped inside her. Her father looked at her for a moment, at the tired eyes, the forced silence, the quiet pain, and his heart broke. Then he turned back to Fani, his voice firm and clear. "Family that drains your child is not family," he said. "It's a shadow pretending to care." Those words hung in the air, cutting through the room like a knife. Fani looked away, pretending not to care, but his face had lost its confidence. Bayo sat still, her chest rising and falling quickly, her father's words echoing deep inside her. She realized he was right. She had been giving everything to people who didn't care if her child slept hungry. That night, something inside her began to awaken. Not anger, but the quiet strength of a woman who had finally seen the truth. Weeks passed, and life in Bayo's home grew colder. She woke up early every day, went to work, came home tired, and found nothing but arguments waiting. When payday came, she felt a small spark of relief. Finally, she could buy groceries, pay rent, and maybe cook a good meal for Nari. But before she could even open the envelope, Fani appeared beside her and grabbed it from her hands. "I'll take care of it," he said, slipping it into his pocket. "You know I handle the family's needs." Bayo stood still, her voice shaking. "Fani, we have no food left. Can we at least buy rice for the week?" He turned and gave a cold laugh. "Go ask your father," he said mockingly. "He seems to care so much about you and your child." His words cut through her heart. She turned away silently, feeling a deep pain she could no longer hide. The next morning, she sent Nari to school with only a small piece of bread. She promised she'd bring something better later, though she didn't know how. By afternoon, her phone rang. It was Nari's teacher, crying on the other end. "Bayo, please come quickly." Nari fainted during class. Bayo's legs went weak. She rushed to the hospital, her heart pounding. When she reached the room, Nari lay on the bed with an IV drip in her arm. Her small face looked pale and tired. Bayo held her hand and broke down, whispering apologies through tears. The doctor came in quietly, looked at her, and said softly, "Your daughter is malnourished. She hasn't been eating properly for a long time. This is neglect." That word hit Bayo like a heavy stone. Neglect. It echoed in her mind again and again. She had worked every day, sacrificed everything, yet her child was suffering. Not because she didn't care, but because she had allowed herself to stay silent. She realized that every time she let Fani take her salary, every time she accepted his insults, she had been choosing fear over her child's well-being. As Nari slept, Bayo sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. Tears rolled down her face, but something inside her began to change. For the first time, she wasn't just sad, she was angry. Angry at Fani, at his family, and at herself for allowing it all. That night, she promised silently that she would never let her daughter go hungry again. Her silence had protected her marriage, but it had broken her child. Now she knew what needed to end. After that night in the hospital, Bayo changed completely. She looked at her sleeping daughter and made a promise. She would never allow anyone to make Nari suffer again. The next morning, she went to work with swollen eyes but a clear mind. She smiled when Fani called to ask for her salary details, pretending everything was normal. Deep inside, though, she had already started planning her escape. Bayo began taking on extra work quietly. After finishing her regular office hours, She stayed late to help with translations for a small agency. At night, when everyone slept, she typed away on her old laptop, earning a few extra dollars from freelance projects. It wasn't much, but to her, it meant freedom. Every time she received payment, she smiled a little. Not because of the money, but because it was something Fani didn't control. She knew she couldn't keep the money in their shared account, so she opened a secret digital account under her father's name. It was the safest way to hide it. She trusted no one but him. Each week, she transferred a small amount there, careful not to draw attention. When Fani noticed her paycheck seemed smaller, he frowned and asked, "Why is your pay less than before?" Bayo stayed calm and said softly, "The company reduced my hours because of cost cutting." He believed her without question, proud of himself for being the main provider again. Bayo kept acting normal, but inside, she was preparing for something bigger. She started calculating rent for a small apartment, checking schools where Nari could continue her education, and listing all the basic things they would need to start over. She even kept a small notebook hidden under her clothes, writing every expense, every plan, every dream. At home, she continued doing her duties as if nothing had changed. She cooked, cleaned, and stayed quiet when Fani sent money to his family. But now, each time he did, she felt less pain. She knew that soon, she wouldn't have to beg him for grocery money or hide her tears from her daughter. Every coin she saved carried a piece of her courage. She wasn't just saving money, she was saving herself. What once felt impossible was slowly becoming real. She could almost see the day she and Nari would wake up in their own space, eat together without fear, and laugh again. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about survival, dignity, and freedom. Things she had once given up but was now ready to reclaim, quietly and fearlessly. When the message came from Fani's mother inviting them to the annual family festival, Bayo felt a sharp pain in her chest. She looked at the near-empty kitchen, and the little rice left in the pot. "We can't even afford food," she said quietly, hoping Fani would understand. But he didn't. Instead, he raised his voice, his pride louder than reason. "You'll go and smile," he ordered. "My family must see we're fine. I don't want anyone thinking we're struggling." Bayo wanted to protest, but she was tired of the endless fights. She nodded silently and prepared for the trip. That morning, she put on her only nice dress, one she had ironed many times to make it look new. She brushed Nari's hair carefully, trying to make her look cheerful even though the child's face looked pale and thin. In her heart, Bayo prayed the day would pass quickly. When they arrived, the yard was full of laughter and music. Tables were lined with plates of meat, rice, and drinks. Fani's family looked well-fed, well-dressed, and full of pride. His mother hugged Fani tightly, praising him for his support. "Our son is such a blessing," she said loudly so everyone could hear. "We never lack anything because of him and his generous wife." The crowd clapped and laughed. Bayo stood behind, her forced smile hiding years of pain. As the meal began, everyone filled their plates. The children of Fani's brothers ran around, laughing and eating freely. Nari sat quietly beside her mother, watching the food pass her by. When she finally reached for a small piece of meat from the shared plate, Fani's brother sneered and pulled it away. "That's for adults, little one," he said carelessly. Nari's small hand froze in midair. She looked up at her mother, confused and embarrassed. Bayo's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to cry, to protect her daughter from this humiliation. But she stayed still, her hands shaking on her lap. Around her, Fani laughed along with his relatives, pretending not to notice. For the rest of the meal, Bayo sat in silence, watching the people who had been living comfortably on her hard-earned money. They joked about how rich Bayo had made their lives easy. No one cared how she looked thinner each month, or how her child was once hospitalized for hunger. When it was time to leave, Fani's family waved goodbye cheerfully, thanking her for her support. As she walked away, holding Nari's hand tightly, something inside her hardened. Her patience, her silence, her fear, they were gone. That festival didn't just expose their hypocrisy. It woke a part of her that had been sleeping too long. The morning after the festival, Bayo sat quietly on the edge of her bed. Her heart felt heavy from all she had seen. The laughter, the humiliation, the way her daughter had been treated like a beggar at a table her own money had helped fill. She looked at Nari sleeping beside her, and knew things couldn't go on like this. As she was lost in thought, A knock came at the door. It was firm, confident, a sound she knew well. It was her father. Mr. Toma walked in, not the gentle man he usually was, but a father who had seen enough. In one hand, he carried 2 large grocery bags filled with food. In the other, a brown envelope thick with papers. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight into the small living room and placed the bags on the table. "I didn't come to argue," he said calmly, looking directly at Fanny. "I came to feed my granddaughter." Fanny stood near the doorway, frowning. "You're embarrassing me, old man," he snapped. "We don't need your pity." Mr. Toma didn't even blink. He opened the brown envelope and slowly pulled out a stack of papers, Bayo's payslips, receipts, and records she had quietly kept over the months. He placed them on the table one by one. "These," he said, "show every dollar my daughter earned. And these," he added, pointing to the transfers, "show where they all went, to your family." Fanny's face went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Bayo stood frozen, her eyes filling with tears. Her father continued, his voice calm but filled with disappointment. "You talk about family pride, but you let your wife and child go hungry while your relatives live well on her sweat. That's not pride, that's shame." He looked around the room, the empty shelves, the cracked plates, the silence of guilt, and then faced Fanny again. "Embarrassment," he said slowly, "is not when a man accepts help. Embarrassment is when a man lets his wife suffer to impress his relatives." Fanny's hands clenched by his side. He tried to speak, but his voice trembled. "You don't understand our family traditions," he muttered weakly. Mr. Toma stepped closer, his eyes sharp. "Tradition should never come before responsibility. You failed your own home." The room fell silent. Bayo stood behind her father, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, protection. Fanny's pride crumbled that day. His lies, his control, his false image were all laid bare in front of the one man he couldn't deceive. And as Mr. Toma walked out, he left behind not just groceries, but the truth. A truth Fanny could no longer hide from. Bayo looked at Fanny, but this time her eyes were calm, no tears, no fear. Something inside her had changed. She had been silent for years, swallowing her pain, pretending everything was fine so her daughter wouldn't grow up in chaos. But that silence had only made Fanny bolder, and his family crueler. Now she was done. "I'm done funding people who mock my efforts," she said softly but firmly. "I'm done apologizing for working hard." Fanny's face twisted in disbelief. "You can't talk to me like that. You think you can just walk away? Everything here belongs to my family." Bayo let out a faint, tired smile. "Then I'll take what doesn't, my peace." She walked to the bedroom, pulled out a small suitcase she had packed days ago, and began folding Nari's clothes neatly inside. Every fold felt like a final goodbye, to years of humiliation, to nights of hunger, to the woman who had once begged for love she never received. Nari stood by the door, clutching her small teddy bear, confused but quiet. Fanny followed her, shouting, "You're nothing without me. You'll come crawling back." But his words didn't touch her anymore. Bayo zipped up the suitcase, turned to him and said, "You've mistaken control for love. I won't let my daughter grow up believing that suffering is normal." She took Nari's hand and walked toward the door. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from freedom. For years, she had carried the weight of a family that saw her only as a wallet. But now, each step she took was lighter. Fanny's voice cracked behind her. "Bayo, you're leaving everything." She paused at the door, looked back once, and replied quietly, "No, I'm leaving nothing. Everything that truly matters is coming with me." The sun outside hit her face as she stepped out, warm, bright, almost welcoming. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew what she wouldn't allow anymore: disrespect, manipulation, and pain disguised as family duty. As she and Nari walked down the street, the little girl asked, "Mama, where are we going?" Bayo smiled gently. "Somewhere peaceful, my love. Somewhere we can breathe." For the first time in years, she felt alive. The world beyond those walls wasn't easy, but it was hers to shape. Behind her, Fanny stood in the doorway, realizing too late that he had lost not just his wife, but the very foundation of his comfort, the woman who built everything he had. And with that, Bayo walked into a new beginning, holding her daughter's hand and her freedom close to her heart. Months passed, and life began to teach Fanny the lessons he once refused to hear. Without Bayo's steady income, everything started to fall apart. His proud family, who used to boast about how rich Bayo supported them, suddenly stopped calling. The free meals, the money for rent, the constant help, all of it was gone. Their so-called loyalty disappeared as quickly as their comfort. Fani tried to borrow from friends, but no one wanted to lend to a man who had lost his only source of stability. The house that once buzzed with laughter and guests now echoed with silence and unpaid bills. Meanwhile, Bayo was learning how to stand on her own 2 feet, and she was thriving. She had rented a small apartment with a bright blue door, where she and Nari started fresh. Using her language skills, she began freelancing online, translating documents and teaching people in other countries how to speak Yoruba and English. Slowly her business grew. Within months, she wasn't just surviving, she was earning double what she once made. Her clients loved her story. A woman who once gave everything to others but finally chose herself. One day, a client she had helped posted about her journey on social media, calling her the woman who turned pain into power. The post went viral. People began following her page, supporting her business, and sending her messages of admiration. For the first time in years, Bayo felt seen, not as someone's wife, not as a provider, but as her own person. Nari was happier too. She had her own room now, filled with books and color. Every night, Bayo would read to her before bed, reminding her that strength and kindness could live together. Life was simple, but it was peaceful, and that peace was priceless. Then one quiet afternoon, the past came knocking. Fani stood at the entrance of her new office, thinner, quieter, with eyes that no longer carried pride, only regret. He looked around, seeing the bright walls, the framed certificates, and the employees who respected her. He took a deep breath. Bayo, I just wanted to say I understand now, he said softly. I see everything you did. I see how wrong I was. Bayo didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him, the man who once made her feel small, and replied calmly, understanding doesn't feed the child you ignored. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Fani lowered his eyes, realizing that apologies couldn't rebuild what he had destroyed. Bayo turned away, returning to her desk where Nari's photo smiled back at her. She didn't need revenge, she already had victory. The tables had turned, not through anger, but through growth. And as Fani walked out of the office, he finally understood what true loss felt like. That a year later, the air in the school hall was filled with excitement and pride. Parents clapped and smiled as students walked on stage to receive their awards. Among them was little Nari, standing tall in her neatly ironed school uniform, her face glowing with joy. When her name was called for the essay competition, Bayo's heart skipped a beat. She held her breath as her daughter walked up to the microphone, holding a piece of paper that looked slightly crumpled from her tiny hands. Nari began to read her essay titled, My Hero. Her voice was small but steady. My hero doesn't wear a cape. She wears tired eyes but never gives up. She's my mom. The entire hall went silent for a moment. Then, as she continued describing how her mother worked hard, helped her with homework, and always made her feel loved, soft murmurs filled the room. Some parents wiped away tears. Even the teachers exchanged emotional glances. Bayo sat in the crowd, her hands trembling as tears rolled down her cheeks. Every word from her daughter felt like a reward for all the nights she had cried quietly, all the mornings she had gone to work with an empty stomach, but a full heart. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was raising a child who saw her worth. When Nari finished reading, the applause was thunderous. She looked out into the crowd, spotted her mother, and waved proudly. Bayo stood up, clapping with tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she didn't try to hide her emotions. She didn't care who was watching. After the ceremony, Mr. Toma placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. You did well, Bayo. You gave that girl more than comfort. You gave her courage. Bayo smiled, her voice trembling as she whispered, I used to think providing meant money. Now I know it means presence. She looked at Nari running toward her, her school medal swinging on her neck, and she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It wasn't the house she left behind or the wealth she once chased that defined her now. It was this moment, her child's joy, her father's pride, and her own quiet strength. As they walked out of the school gate hand in hand, Bayo felt lighter than ever. The scars of her past were still there, but they no longer hurt. She had rebuilt not just her life, but her heart. And deep down, she knew the truth she had fought so hard to learn. No man, no loss, No betrayal could ever take that away again. She was the real provider, not of wealth, but of love, strength, and hope. He gave her salary to impress others, but she turned her pain into power, proving real wealth isn't shared through money, it's earned through courage.